This is so exciting! Nicola nearly squealed and bounced in place for a moment. A gesture that everyone around her now knew had a core of genuineness to it, while also being hammed up a lot for the camera that was filming her. Simon kept a good distance, and made sure that she was in frame at all times, even as he gradually circled around the group with his equipment, to show off a bit more of the scale of the event he was capturing to the audience. Together with Nicola, a good part of the allied running mates in the ongoing election had gathered together in front of a large airlock's door, waiting for their opportunity to welcome a new guest of honour. And around them, a large protective bubble of soldiers, both local and human, had formed, constantly busy and at attention in order to manage the multiple crowds of people who had come together in order to also observe what was the beginning of yet another one of the slowly increasing number of truly historic events for the galactic community. Naturally, people had come here with very different expectations for and feelings about the event itself. In recent times, many of them, but James especially, had quite often found themselves in front of large crowds, sending very mixed signals, of course. However, this was on a different scale. Even when compared to James's inauguration, which by all rational measures was absolutely the far bigger deal, this gathering of people somehow completely overshadowed it in magnitude. It had gotten to the point where some of the local organisational authorities had some very serious doubts about the capacities of the council station itself, especially in case of something emergent happening during the event. To combat the issue, what equated to a small fleet of medical and material support ships had been called in from the surrounding core worlds, which were now standing by, ready to provide assistance in case something with the enormous crowd should indeed go awry. The massive outcome of people baffled most, and everyone could only assume that it had to do with the people who were being whipped into a frenzy by certain parties in the meantime, which had led to what the media generously called increased political mobility. And, well, mobility was right in a way. As he looked around, following Simon with his gaze as he circled around the group, James could see the difference between the crowd that had been there for his ascendance to the council, and the one that had now flooded onto the station now with his own two eyes. Previously, the crowds had been generally made up of the locals keeping the station running, as well as the people hailing from close-by planets, just taking a day vacation, in order to witness his speech firsthand, with only very few people coming from further away, if they could afford it, time and money-wise. But now, it almost seemed like any geographical borders had been erased, leaving the community station as a home for what was well and truly the most intermixed population of people James had ever witnessed. No matter if Standard, Core or Deathworld, its population could be found among the crowd. In fact, James was actually sure that he had seen at least one person hailing from each of the high-class Deathworlders among the crowd at this point. Another difference was that, back after his own arrival, the local security had still refrained from separating the people of different orientations within the crowd, trusting civility to win out in this place dedicated to peaceful politics, where other spots in the galaxy had long started keeping different factions in the crowd apart, in order to avoid chaos. However, that too had all gone out the window now, and the securing forces were very hard at work to make sure the different political camps stayed within their dedicated areas. And those different camps didn't just consist of the people with them, the ones against them, and neutral ones this time. Instead, many different dedicated groups could be readily identified almost at a glance now, all bringing their own thoughts, biases and ideologies with them. The ones who were being physically separated the furthest from each other were the people who had rallied around the acting councilman Kashalengas, who didn't seem to leave the house without signs or other indicators proclaiming their fear the predators rhetoric anymore, and the resisting movement, which has seemingly been founded specifically to combat them on the battlefield of ideas. The members of that one were even easier to make out, of course, as they all had their faces splattered with, luckily rather unconvincing, fake blood. James still cringed a bit at that specific choice of expressing their gripes. However, although those two groups had to be kept the furthest away from each other, they were by far not the only ideologies which had found themselves observing the occasion. Others James could spot based on signs or snippets of speeches he heard from their leading figures included, but were likely not limited to Those who believed that predators and Deathworlders were welcome in the galaxy, but drew the line at unnaturals. Their exact opposites, who believed people should give augmented individuals a chance and understood the want to be relieved of serious ailments through unorthodox procedures, who however very much thought that predators and Deathworlders needed to be controlled. Some people who appeared convinced that the entire conflict was merely a fabrication for the press, while James and those he allegedly opposed were actually colluding behind closed doors, and only putting on this whole act to try and make the large political changes they planned easier to stomach for the general populace. And a rather colourful group of people, who used the ongoing conflict as fuel to lobby for their ideas to blow off the election and disband the council and community entirely, leaving the galaxy in a free-for-all that would decide the new leadership and rules based on the rule of might. The oddest part about that group was that it strangely did not appear to be populated with high-class Deathworlders, or otherwise dominant species who one would expect to come out victorious in such a scenario, leaving James to wonder just where exactly the appeal behind it was for them. In the meantime, Simon had finished his slow, panning circle around the group, standing isolated at the centre of the enormous crowd, and James could see how the young man fully zoomed in towards Nicola once more, just in time to film her slightly cheekily waving at the camera teams of other news organisations, which of course all had to wait behind the protective line of soldiers. She certainly enjoyed having the first privilege to be directly on the scene, and she had absolutely no qualms about showing it, even if she did keep an absolutely sweet expression on her face as she did. Besides the two influencers, James's accompaniment for today of course consisted of the usual suspects, who obviously were all just as eager to meet Curi again as he was. Also present were Finn, who expressed great interest in finally meeting the mysterious cyborg, Admiral Krieger, who saw it as her duty to welcome the long-lost refugee, and also secretly had a couple of private matters to discuss with them sooner rather than later, Ajaxia, who came as an obvious choice, considering she was the other council candidate with obvious augmentations, and finally Morgoth, who was always right there standing by whenever an emotional rock to lean on might be needed. Suddenly, his gaze was caught by an indicator light above the airlock. The last few minutes, it has shone with a large, very intentionally obvious indication of danger. However now, that light extinguished, leaving the indicator dull and lifeless. The atmosphere in the dock had been reinstated, which meant the shuttle could now be safely disembarked from. James's jaw clenched slightly out of unexpected nervousness. He really didn't know why he suddenly felt so tense about Curi coming through that door. After all, it was just Curi, not exactly someone he was worried about meeting. Yet, somehow, it still felt so weighty. His head snapped up a little bit, as a more physical weight suddenly pressed against his shoulder, and just a slight shift of his gaze immediately informed him that Sheeta had allowed her body to drop and lean against him ever so gently, her ear closest to him twitching lightly, as she too stared at the now extinguished light. The expression on her face was forcibly neutral. However, with how close they were standing to each other, James could very much see her lower lip subtly trembling as she tried to suppress expressing further emotions. It seemed that, wherever that weight he felt may have come from, he was at least not alone in feeling it. To comfort both her and himself, he wrapped his arm around hers and took her hand in his, as they more or less patiently waited for the door to finally open. Meanwhile, the sign that the main event was about to unfold had also not been missed by the surrounding crowds, which in turn led to the volume in the room increasing by an order of magnitude, as every one of the group's leading figures, of course, began to prepare their people for the guest of honor's arrival, with loosely prepared or entirely improvised speeches that all mashed and mingled with each other from where James was standing, leaving them as nothing but audio blur. The energy grew tense as the white noise slowly got so loud that it became hard to hear your own thoughts, and just as it had seemingly reached its crescendo, it suddenly got cut right through by the mechanical noise of the engines, putting the airlock's enormous door into motion. For a brief moment, the room got quiet as the door moved, though sadly, the The more self-important people among the different groups did not show the decency to actually allow Curi to enter into a quietly awaiting room. Instead, they used the ensuing moment of silence to increase their own volume even more, basically yelling their speeches out in an attempt to be the one heard, now that the more mindful figures among them had shut their face. However, James managed to tune them out. The only thing that he actively noticed, despite his intense focus on the opening door, was by how Simon quickly got into position behind him to film the big reveal from a better angle. With a hiss of compressed air, the steel gate moved out of the way relatively swiftly, making way for the view of an approaching party that, much like the surrounding soldiers, consisted of both human and community forces walking in a protective formation. And there, right in its middle, walked a very familiar black shape. James moved before he even knew it, not at all content with the idea of staying in place and needing to wait even just a few moments for Curi to approach him. For a moment, a part of him was worried that his sudden movement may have disturbed Shida. However, he then had to notice that the arm he used to hold her hand was, in fact, already under tension, as she was actually pulling him along in the cyborg's direction. He had no idea just when she had gotten ahead of him, but he wasn't going to complain either. The next immediate worry of his aware mind was then if the wall of soldiers between them and the cyborg was going to cause any problems, the community one specifically posing an obstacle in his eyes. Though that worry was likely born from overcaution as well, since his face was among the most recognizable in the entire community at this point, and his relationship with Curi was also not a secret to anybody. Therefore, even the guards not beholden to his or his mother's orders took little more than a brief glance at him before moving out of the way to allow him to approach his friend. Curi already lifted their face up to look at him. Emotional movement was impossible to read off the cyborg's face, as always. However, James simply assumed that they were happy to see him as well. He had to, considering how his heart was hammering at the mere sight of that unmoving face, with the two red eyes. It was hard not to hopefully project those same feelings onto the other, which of course had the potential to backfire hilariously, but he was going to take that risk. The same appeared to be true for Shida, since she, as soon as they had passed the line of soldiers, let go of his hand and dashed the small remaining distance at blinding speeds, to the point that James was briefly afraid that she was going to hurt herself by barreling straight into Curi's solid metal body. Luckily, the feline had far more control over her own abilities than his worried ape-brain gave her credit for, and so she managed to stop right before any teeth were lost by face meeting with metal plate. Instead, Shida crouched down just slightly, her ears drooping as she lowered her head and pressed it against Curi's, ever so subtly rubbing it left to right, while James could hear her purr engine starting up, even from where he still lagged behind her. Curi seemed ever so slightly baffled by the welcome they got. Though it was not the first time Shida had shown outright affection to them by any measure, this was certainly the most immediate it had ever happened. Still, it only took them a moment of adjustment before they lifted one of their foremost legs and very carefully hooked it around Shida's body in the best equivalent of a hug they could offer in their current position. "Hello, Shida," they then greeted, shifting ever so slightly so that their eyes could look at Shida just a little better, while the feline nuzzled against them. "I have missed you too." Shida didn't seem to feel the need to actually say anything, letting her actions speak for her. "It's so good to see you as a free person again, Curi," James greeted the cyborg in her stead, as soon as he had come into conversational distance. "It feels even better to be a free person again," Curi assured him immediately, extending their other foremost leg out to greet him. James smiled gently and gave it a firm squeeze with his mechanical hand. He definitely wanted to embrace Curi as well for their reunion. However, considering everything that happened, he was going to let Shida have her moment. "You're going to have to tell me everything once we have the time," he said, and let out a mildly reserved sigh as he spoke, feeling some of the weight he felt earlier lift off his shoulders now that he actually got to talk to Curi. They had changed a bit. He could tell. But that was likely unavoidable with all the things that had happened to them in the meantime. And it also didn't appear to be for the worse. "I'm going to have to write some sort of thank you letter to your lawyer," he then mumbled, as he pulled his hand away after holding their leg for an almost awkwardly long moment. "And, probably apologize." Curi made an acknowledging motion with their leg, likely avoiding their usual full-body nod in order to not disturb Shida. "Dr. Duarte was a great help, and although I understand that it is her occupation, and she is handsomely compensated for it, I do still owe her great gratitude," they confirmed. Then, their leg hung slightly, and they shifted just a little bit to look down at the ground with at least one of their eyes. "Though I still consider it a great misfortune that her great professionalism was necessary at all, simply to prove I can live by myself." James exhaled a hissing breath through his teeth and grimaced. "Yeah," he grumbled at first, before shaking his head and forcing himself to lighten up a little. "But hey, I guess now's our chance to change that." Curi looked up at him. Although their eyes gave him nothing to immediately read, he knew them well enough to detect a certain thoughtfulness behind the way they were studying him. "This invitation, do you consider it to be genuine?" they asked him directly. Although they seemed candid to the idea, there was a certain undertone of doubt even in their synthetic voice. James exhaled out of one corner of his mouth, and his forced smile faltered a bit. "Honestly, I think there's an agenda behind it, possibly a trap," he admitted outright. Not only did he know that keeping that much from Curi was going to put them into far greater danger, he also simply did not want to keep any secrets from them. He didn't want to in the past, and he certainly didn't now. Still, his smile eventually returned, a bit more honest than before this time, as he added, "But that doesn't mean we can't make the best of it. If there's one thing I've gotten good at this point, is to use the platform they inadvertently give me with whatever schemes they plot. I mean, look at me. Got me all the way to councilman." He chuckled, though Curi's gaze remained thoughtful. "I intend to use it," then stated directly. Once again shifting their stance a bit, they removed the leg they had laid around Shida. In a motion, they tapped her gently, indicating that they would like to be let go now. Despite how lost she had seemed to be in her nuzzling, Shida reacted almost instantly, pulling away from Curi and freeing up their way so they could continue walking. "We won't let anyone take your moment from you, Curi," she announced, with a certainty that was both reassuring and very fiery. Perhaps even a little too fiery, though that may have been James's imagination. As he turned to walk along with them towards the rest of the group, his eyes briefly got stuck on something that broke the near pitch-black appearance of Curi's body, and his expression darkened as the image burned into his mind. The patch on the side of their body was inconspicuous for the most part, just a discoloured spot on an otherwise black surface. However, it weighed so much heavier than that. Curi had never been out to do anything to anyone. For so many years, they had been perfectly content with sticking to themselves and focusing on their work while simply living with the world's disdain for them, always simply suffering in silence, instead making any attempts to force anyone to so much as look at them. And yet, this was the second time that someone had come so close to taking their life. Took aim at this person who had truly only been trying to appease. This time, he had not been there to help them, and he was endlessly glad about the fact that he even got the chance to meet them again, that he hadn't missed his chance to see them simply because he tried to do what was best for them, by leaving their fate in the presumably capable hands of someone else that time. However, there was one thing about it all that still irked him to no end, and he didn't even know how to bring it up. There was no point in asking a dumb question like, did he really do it? Neither Curi nor any of the other people witnessing the deed had any reason to lie about it. Or at least a good part of them didn't. Reprique had taken the shot and took down Curi's would-be assassin. The very person who had tried to enable someone to take their life in the past had taken action and saved it this time. And James could not fathom why he did it. There were many weak excuses he could come up with, but none that truly satisfied him as an explanation. The event was an enigma to him, and he didn't even know where to start with possibly unraveling it. There was, of course, one idea that would entirely explain it. However, James refused to even consider it. After all, he had very good reason to. In the meantime, everyone else who had been more patient than James, and stayed behind at first, now also approached Curi. The white noise around the airlock was extreme, and so was a storm of flashing lights from all sorts of recording devices that still tried to capture every moment of what was going on. The chain of people greeting Curi had autonomously organized itself into a descending order of familiarity, starting with Moore and Conglorch, who leaned down to greet the cyborg, their large hands carefully moving over their metal exoskeleton. "A few battle scars suit everyone. Even you, it seems," Conglorch greeted first, a low rumble emerging from his throat as he briefly bowed his head to Curi. "You fought well."
"That you did,"
Moore confirmed with a warmer tone, as her claws gently scratched along one of Curi's legs.
"A hard-fought victory in a fight that was unfairly thrust upon you. I can hardly imagine what it must have taken out of you, but even though it is a victory you should not have needed to win, I do hope that you can stand proud with it. It is a bright statement to the world."
Curi slowly lowered their body and then rose again, mimicking Conglorch's bow. "Thank you, both of you," they said, before shifting to fully look up at the two much taller beings. "I would much rather not have gone through all this. However, since it did happen and there is nothing to be done about it, I can only hope that we may use my progress as a way to keep others from suffering the same injustice."
"A laudable goal,"
Moore said with a smile, though after a second, her gaze shifted slightly, her expression turning into a carefully thoughtful one.
"Excuse me," she then said with some hesitation. "I am truly not trying to make this moment about myself, but would my children have happened to tell you anything meant for me before you departed?"
To everyone's surprise, Curi very briefly sank into themselves and shuddered slightly, before rising again with a now somewhat more seemingly relaxed stance. "No, they did not tell me anything before I departed," Curi replied directly, and it seemed like Moore got worried by their reaction for a second. That was before the cyborg continued with, "They did, however, ask me to not tell you about their accompanying me until the time we reached the council station. And even though I loathe lying, Kentha and Zarabi managed to convince me of the value of a surprise. I hope it will be worth my discomfort." Moore's large brown eyes blinked blankly for a moment as she processed the cyborg's words.
"They're accompanying you?"
she then repeated, as things slowly clicked into place for her.
"They are here?"
Curi nodded once more. "Only briefly," they clarified. "They wish to see you at least briefly before they will return home. Right now they are waiting in the shuttle." Moore's gaze lifted to look inside the airlock, and her clawed hand reached up to her mouth to ineffectively cover her reaction for a moment, as her eyes went wide and damp. Then she quickly looked back down at Curi, her gaze briefly switching back and forth between them and the distant shuttle, clearly torn on what to do. "We will have ample time to catch up," Curi told her directly, after a few seconds of her struggling. "You should go see them now." Moore's claws sunk down from her face and briefly hooked into the thick fur around her neck, her hand clenching into a fist.
"Excuse me,"
she then said, sounding honestly apologetic as she began to move past the cyborg and into the airlock. Conglorch released a half-amused, half-annoyed bellow before seemingly deciding to also get out of the way, to let someone else have their turn. James's team and Nia approached as a closed unit, all briefly patting Curi's metal skin and giving them brief words of encouragement, though given the hostile atmosphere, none of them seemed to want to linger for long. "I owe you, Curi," Admiral Krieger said, as it was her turn to approach the cyborg. She subtly pat against her leg, causing a very dull sound that was very much inorganic. "Your technology came in quite handy. Thank you for allowing us to use it so readily." Curi nodded and inspected the leg for a moment, though there wasn't a whole lot to see through the uniform's black pants. "It is what the technology was always meant for," they stated, as they looked back up at the Admiral's face. "I am glad to see you using it, and I hope it will serve you well."
"It already is," the Admiral assured her now fellow cyborg. "You are a rare breed of person, Curi, and humanity counts itself lucky to have you among our allies."
As they heard that, Curi appeared to be stunned for a moment, though the exact reason for that was hard to discern.
"Humanity will always have my support,"
they then said. And, like they had done with Conglorch earlier, they bowed to the Admiral, who quickly waved the gesture off.
"Let me know if I can ever help you with anything,"
the Admiral then stated, though she also quickly added,
"outside of my professional capabilities, of course."
"Of course," Curi replied, with a hint of amusement swinging along with their synthetic voice. They then moved slightly, positioning their eyes so that they could more directly look at the other, slightly aged human, who approached from behind the Admiral.
"My brother, Finn Krieger,"
the Admiral quickly introduced, so there would be no awkward pause.
"The man who raised James,"
Curi surmised, and studied the older man for a moment, reaching out one of their legs in greeting like they had done earlier.
"The very one,"
Finn confirmed, and heartily shook the offered leg.
"Tried my best to get a good head onto his shoulders. Semi-successfully so, I would say."
Curi waited for their leg to be let go again, and only spoke up once they had fully retracted it.
"I know that the choices he makes are their own,"
they then stated with some hesitation, as they briefly glanced back towards James before returning their gaze to Finn.
"But I might owe you more than you realize."
Finn scoffed slightly, but not in a demeaning way.
"Yeah, he told me one or the other thing about you,"
he said, stemming his hands onto his hips as he also looked back towards James for a moment.
"But you're right. He's his own man. All I can do is be proud of the one he became."
"Don't make eye contact with me when you say that," James quickly scolded his uncle, though there was no actual force in his voice. Finn let out a hearty, though slightly hoarse laugh at that, throwing his head back slightly. Then he looked at Curi once more, a gentle smile on his face.
"Well, I must have done something right,"
he stated in a more confident manner.
"And since we're being grateful, allow me to thank you for being there for him. I heard you were a great help with that arm of his. With Sophia's leg as well, of course, but a bit more indirect there."
Curi looked down a bit again, but it almost seemed to be in embarrassment that time.
"Few things make me happier than my technology helping people," they said.
Their voice didn't really get sheepish, but James could imagine it would be exactly that, if he got the chance to right now. Finn laughed again, though a bit more restrained that time. Finally, only Ajaxia was left in the line of greeters, since the influencers stayed back and on reporting duty, while Morgoth appeared to be happy to just give a warm welcome and leave it at that.
"This is a big moment for the community,"
the Lakshasette said, after they exchanged brief greetings with each other.
"I could hardly imagine anyone better to usher it in than you."
Her thick tail gave a single wag, and she shifted her weight from one leg to the other as her stiff, green and mechanically yellow eyes briefly looked into the distance, seemingly not seeing the crowd of people she was actually looking at.
"I know you had your differences, but I still wish Optiforay could be here to witness it,"
she then said, and her gaze suddenly returned to reality with a saddened expression. Curi sank into themselves a bit.
"He had his questionable sides, certainly," they confirmed,
obviously thinking back to the man they once knew. The very one who had taken care of Ajaxia's eye, and who had also provided information for their own augmentations, even if they never allowed him to personally work on them.
"But he most definitely did not deserve the fate he suffered, and I am sure in a world like the one we are trying to build, he would have had the chance to pursue his craft in the much more professional manner he desired. I, too, would have liked to see what he would do, if he could be here to be a part of it."
Ajaxia nodded and very briefly reached up to rub something away from her organic eye.
He had his quirks, but he genuinely cared, she then said quietly, shifted her hand away from her organic eye and over to the mechanical one. Curi reached out and gently ran the tip of their leg along the Vulpine's arm. "Has your eye been getting the necessary care?" they then asked, after giving the woman a moment to calm down. Ajaxia giggled softly. "Yes, it has. The human medical engineering departments are quite impressive, and very thorough. I have not had this many touch-ups since I first got it implanted," she reported with genuine happiness that broke through the gloom of her earlier mood. "No wonder, now, that I know they use some of your technology as well." Curi shook their body slightly. "They were exceptional before I came along. I simply left them with a few simple ideas, and much of it was based on their own technology already," they explained, seemingly eager to not steal any valor. "I guess they are," Ajaxia replied, and briefly scanned around, her entire head moving as she allowed the gaze of her stiff eyes to run across the many, many humans who surrounded them at the time. "I guess we better be careful to not fall behind then." Curi shook their body again. "It is not a competition," they stated, their voice getting just a bit quieter as they spoke now. "It is collaboration, and it is so incredibly beautiful." From where he stood, James listened up a bit at that word. Beautiful. That was a very loaded term for Curi, considering everything they had gone through. From the things they had to endure among their people for their apparent beauty, to the things they had taken upon themselves in the pursuit of their own sense of it. The term wasn't something they threw around. It held weight to them. Therefore, hearing them use beautiful specifically to describe something, it did give a little kick to James's already strained heart. Ajaxia nodded, seeming to get the cyborg's meaning as well, though her large ears then twitched a bit, moving and shifting to listen to the still ongoing white noise of many agitated voices. "It is easy to forget that," she said quietly, obviously doing her best to not turn her head towards the uproar of the crowd. "We will remind them," Curi stated firmly, a confidence in their voice of which James was not sure if he had ever heard it from them in this form. And, quite honestly, a confidence that he wished he felt to that degree as well. Curi moved laboriously on the spot, their 6 legs working in tandem to allow them to turn to the larger, assembled group. Throughout the entirety of their arrival, they had done a marvelous job of ignoring the turmoil going on all around them. And even now, as they were presumably looking right at it, there was not a hint of discomfort about it visible in their demeanor. "Shall we go? There is much to do," they said. No, announced, leaving everyone in a need of a reaction for a few moments. James and Sheeda especially glanced at each other, almost baffled for a moment. However, then they smiled. "You're right," James soon replied. "Let's not keep the galaxy waiting."